Sharon. Good afternoon, everybody. I guess good morning still if you're on the other side of the state. Um, as Sharon mentioned, I was kind of reached out to a couple weeks ago with the request of talking about trees for birds, and I'm going to kind of loop in a little bit more to that because as much as talking about trees and birds is can be very interesting. I am a bigger fan of the bigger picture of not just the canopy, but also the ground, and trying to maximize the space you have for the benefits of wildlife and beauty and all the other things that go along with gardening and landscaping and managing our natural resources. So a little bit of context here. Um, Forests in Kentucky. So we start talking about trees. I'm in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. We always think about trees in the context of forests, and that can be true. Within the state of Kentucky, 49% of the state is considered forested, whether that's in small woodland patches or, as it is in most of the East, contiguous forests that stretch along the mountains. All of those play really important roles for many of our bird species. We have well over 300 that are utilizing the state at some point or another. But in the context of this talk, I want to make sure we are thinking, as I mentioned, of, forests themselves are really important, but, looking at just what is in your backyard and how you're providing habitat, what animals use to survive. Providing that habitat in a yard, sometimes it has to be a multi-tier approach from the ground all the way up to the top of a 100-foot oak tree. So often we can do that in ways that are both pleasing to the eye, as well as providing some ecosystem benefits, which at the very least will help provide birds, a user of those ecosystems, some benefits. So I mentioned there are over 300 birds that are using Kentucky, and there's a lot of different species and the variation between them is immense. From the golden eagles and bald eagles that we have that often are talked about at Bernheim, as well as many waterfowl species, down to things like this kinglet shown here, and even smaller hummingbirds and so on. There's a wide range of sizes and also a wide range of species that in terms of what they're using within the state of Kentucky. And most of the time when we talk about birds, we're going to throw them into some bigger groups. We like to group things in science, right? In the context of birds, we group them usually into a couple different groups. Some of those have legal ramifications, right? So we have things like migratory, seasonal residents, and non-migratory residents. So for full-time permanent residents, things like cardinals, versus those that are completely migratory that may be in Kentucky for a day, be in Kentucky for a season, right? Breed here, not breed here, may pass through both in spring and fall migration. So you have all of these different kind of uses, but on the legal side of things, why we care is migratory birds are federally protected. So things like waterfowl that are almost entirely migratory, except for those that you tend to find in the parks, and things like resident Canada geese. But those, vultures, raptors, songbirds, all fall into that migratory protection. The seasonal birds can be those that, like I said, pass through, but we also have 150 different species that actually breed within the state of Kentucky, both resident and migratory, and we have over 200 winter residents, or those that migrate through our state during the winter. And that's usually when we pick up a lot of our waterfowl species, because they spend most of their time in Canada and the prairies and the potholes to breed, and then use our area to winter because they kind of hug that snow ice line as best they can. Within all of these birds, they all have these very specific habitat needs and uses, and they're going to seek those out. So whenever we talk to landowners about managing wildlife, we always ask them, what do you want to have on your property? What species do you want to see? Because the species are going to respond to habitat. We use the phrase "build it and they will come." Right? Field of dreams scenario. If you build it, they will come. They will find it eventually. And if you have enough of what they need, they tend to hang around. So if you want to see cardinals, you don't need a whole lot of alterations in the landscape to meet the needs of a cardinal. Same with things like robins. You know, robins do quite well with open lawns as long as you have earthworms in them and a couple trees nearby that provide some shelter for storms and predators. However, if you want to get into certain species, like a rare species, like something like a cerulean warbler or a golden wing warbler that require very specific habitat components and sizes to their forests, it gets a lot harder to attract them to your yard, your property, and landscape. So kind of to help facilitate this, because I love little cartoon images of birds. So I've got a good one here, ruby-throated hummingbirds that a lot of folks want to see in their yards, and you can do a lot in your yard to benefit them. Um, right, so we can identify them usually through throat patches, but to be honest, they're our number one hummingbird in the state. We don't really have many others. On occasion, we have a few other species that will pop in, but most of the time that's fairly rare. But knowing things like, okay, what does a hummingbird eat? And that would be, you know, all of us usually think of nectar, but to be honest, they consume a lot more than that. They do consume nectar, but they eat a lot of insects. They'll consume sap on occasion, and they have other requirements, right? So we have hummingbirds that breed in the state of Kentucky. They also, to help build their nest, need spider webs. So if you're out spraying your yard and getting rid of all the insects in the yard, you don't have spiders there creating webs, and your neighbors does the same thing. All of a sudden, they don't have key components they need to build a nest, set up a home range, and breed, and therefore they will move on to another area. So ensuring that you meet the needs of the species on your property during the time of year they're present is going to help you facilitate and improve your area for those birds. Does that make sense? Like I said, I like bird cartoons. That's why it's here. I have a vulture one, but that's a really hard one to sell for backyards. And also, you know, trees. So other things that you need to be thinking about is I'm going to mention a lot about habitat and trees and forests. Within forests and forest birds, often we talk about, oh, certain tree species are better than others. Well, there's also a component of the age of the tree and the composition of the forest and what that structure that exists within those provides. So something that we see a lot of in the state of Kentucky is 80 to 120-year-old hard mast trees like oaks and hickories, which are great and wonderful, but they make a very uniform habitat type. Sometimes there's shrubs underneath and younger trees that are trying to fill in the gaps, but sometimes there is not. But it does provide a very large canopy, fully developed, that's mature and with no real gaps in it. And therefore you have a canopy that's 80, 100 feet up in the air, and it's going to benefit certain species of birds, like things like ovenbirds, many of our woodpeckers, but it won't benefit things like towhees that require shrubby, younger habitat. So we like to talk about forests and being dynamic, right? And the fact that they change over time, but also when we talk about managing forests for wildlife and trees for wildlife, we like to see varying ages of forests and structures of those forests because within each age, you're going to have different trees that appear as the dominant canopy species. Even a 10-foot tall forest has a canopy that's forming. So you'll see more things like sumacs and redbuds and dogwoods coming up in those younger forests, tulip poplars. Whereas when that forest begins aging out, the oaks tend to take over, hickories take over, and you lose a lot of different species. So having a varying age forest is going to provide you a lot of different habitat. So that is something that's really hard to do in a backyard, right? And picking trees that are good for wildlife. It's just more of context of why not all forests should be 80 to 100 years old over a forest. We need those. We also need 10-year-old forests, and we need everything in between at levels that are providing habitat across the state and across the region, across the Appalachian Mountains. that allow the wildlife that we have to find what they need, right? And find that field of dreams. So that kind of brings me to how can you help? So say you have a property, so maybe a backyard, maybe you have 10 acres, maybe you have 100 acres. How can you help wildlife if that's your goal? And reality being, you can do one of two things. You can alter the habitat you have, and habitat is never created or lost. It just changes form from that old growth. Say you have a logger come in and cut your older trees, opens up the canopy. Now you have young forest growing in that same space. So that just changed it from a 100-year-old tree to a 2-year-old tree. You didn't lose habitat, you just made it a different habitat. So when we talk about wildlife management, we use that ability to alter habitat form to do things like create food sources. We can create cover, right? And it's all based on individual species needs. But with birds, a lot of times what we're talking about is we want to ensure that you have native habitat to the area for the species that you're looking to attract. So most often, we're not looking at managing for starlings or English or house sparrows. We're looking at doing things for a lot of the more colorful birds, neotropical migrants, our warblers, our grosbeaks, our vireos, and they are going to key in on native plants. So whenever we talk about managing, say, a yard, we want to not necessarily just put out a feeder, but which is something you can do in certain time periods. It's good to do, but we want to start converting that over to food sources that are going to be beneficial to the animals you're trying to attract. So talk about increasing food and plant natives. What does that actually mean? How do you choose the natives? Because a tulip poplar is not the same as an oak. A hawthorn is not the same as a holly, right? So what are the things that you're looking to provide? And that depends on the species. But usually it's two things that we're looking to increase in order to create food for birds. The first is not a direct one, but it's probably a more important one in the scheme of birds, especially those that are breeding and nesting in Kentucky, and that is insects. We're trying to increase the prevalence of insects in an area, and they're keying in on plant species that there are their host species to breed on, right? So think monarchs and milkweeds. And that is true for a lot of species. There are some more generalist insects, but a lot of times they're pretty well tied to certain, especially families or genus of plants, and that's where they do their breeding. So you want to diversify your plants or potentially narrow it in based on the insects you want to attract that feed the birds you want. The second part is mast. And mast is basically the fruiting bodies of trees or bushes or shrubs. And that is a seasonal food that is created usually as a seed source from that plant to get and propagate itself on the landscape. And they're usually directly consumed by wildlife, right? So if we look at cherries, we look at hollyberries, dogwood berries, all the above. Birds are going to sit there and pick them off and consume them when they're available, which is great if it's a native tree. But if you're a grape grower or a wine lover, then you definitely don't want them eating those things in the vineyard. But native grapes are an awesome food source for birds, as is poison ivy, which you don't necessarily want in your yard. But what we're trying to do are pick species that are going to maximize the insect presence, which is an indirect food source that you alter on the landscape in abundance, or you're planting a lot of species that create mass, seed sources, fruiting bodies that are going to increase food. So when we start thinking about what kind of trees and shrubs do that, it's a lot. And basically, there's several different varieties and sizes of trees and shrubs that are going to provide some kind of masting body or some kind of host plant status that increases your food availability. So, things like northern catalpa has a very specific caterpillar that a lot of fishermen go find and shake the trees on in the summer to go catch sunfish with, and bluegill and all those things. But guess what? There's also a lot of birds that are out there navigating and picking along those tree branches looking for those catalpas and the caterpillars. Things like eastern redbud provides a great nectar source, and hummingbirds can use it. They're an early migrator, but oftentimes you see a little bit of insects that are using that are going to be more your pollinators, which could become food for a lot of migrating birds. Other shrubs that we often see in yards that are great are things like serviceberry, so trees and shrubs. So serviceberry is a wonderful one. It's that produces an ample amount of fruit that both you can consume and the birds, and often it's cleaned off before you find it. But other ones include things like holly, and all the sumacs are great ones, not necessarily for the fruiting body, right? But the seeds that are created long term. Dogwoods are great. Hollies are wonderful. But the big one, if you're talking about trying to benefit many of our neotropical migrants, are things like oaks, hickories, and that is because they are the number one in terms of the number of Lepidoptera, so butterfly and moth caterpillars are found on those species. So if you plant a native oak, you're supporting birds and probably other wildlife because of the acorns that are created. Birds are not going to eat the acorns very much. They are going to eat the insects. So all of those, any of those native plants have insects and usually are creating some kind of fruiting body. That's good. If we start talking about native plants, we want to be thinking about a couple different groups. And usually it's about trying to pick a variety of plants that are both flowering and creating seeds at different time periods. So you want to find early flowering plants like columbine that are a great resource for your migrating hummingbirds, to bee balm and your coral honeysuckles that are going to carry through during the summer and late summer, to finally cardinal flowers that are later on in the year that are kind of holding on through and through. Milkweed is a similar fashion, right? So you have varying milkweed species where you start seeing common milkweed first, and butterfly milkweed, and then finally now we have swamp milkweed that's kind of just finishing. You want to pick things that are flowering at different times and also producing different seeds. You can use all kinds of different native plants and what we call forbs, right, in our side. And usually you can really fill out a yard with a lot of color. And some of these have more benefits towards pollinators and insects than they do, say, birds, but something like the Echinacea group, right? So you show your coneflowers, your black-eyed Susans, they're doing both because I usually I have a lot of coneflowers and on my property, and that is twofold. It's great for the bees and butterflies. But now is when I see things like goldfinch that are sitting on top of it, picking out the seeds to get to those. Thistles are another good one that we don't often think about as a great plant, but it is a wonderful resource for goldfinch and your other finches. Sunflowers, all of that family and group are great resources as seeds for birds as they try to get through the winter. And it's especially important that you don't cut them off now as they're starting to go into winter. Leave them be, leave those heads up there and wait till the spring to really get rid of them in your yards. Because that's, you cut them, you get rid of that food source. So any of these genus or families is going to be a wonderful choice for birds in your yard, both as direct food sources and as those insect supporters that become and work up the chain to being food sources for many of the bird species. So that hard mass side is the difficult side. Those are your nuts, right? So your acorns, your hickory nuts, your beech nuts. Often those are not really used directly by the birds. If you want turkeys, they're a wonderful resource. Grab those little red oaks. They go down. Wood ducks actually love them. But there's not many birds that are going to directly consume that hard mast. There's a few blue jays can sometimes consume some of the smaller acorn species, but often it's not. It is the insects on the hard mast species that they're going to really key in on. So it's good to have them in your yard, but it's not necessarily important as a direct food source. The conifers, on the other side, they kind of play a more thermal role where they're providing a lot of winter cover from storms and predators when there's no leaves on many and many of the other plants in the landscape. Our cedars produce berries, and our pine trees produce cones that have seeds in them, but they're not regularly used by a lot of species for food supply, but their role in the landscape as a buffer and predator protection from both for weather and predators is a really good thing to have. Having an entire field of cedars may not be the best, but having a couple areas that you have some cedars is going to provide that cover and opportunity for protection for those animals when they need it. So I talked a little bit about trees and picking trees. One of the things that you need to be thinking about is making sure that you're picking a tree and putting it in the right place, right tree, right place. And there's a couple things you need to be thinking about is some of the soil components of, is this a well-drained site? Is it a moist enough site? But some of the things that we often overlook after that are things like, am I planting a tree under a power line that is going to have to be pruned on a regular basis? So you want to try to choose things that are a little shorter, your red buds, your elderberries, all those smaller trees, and try to put them there, and then pick some appropriate trees in other areas of your property. And many of the times, there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of resources out there to kind of help you navigate that. So I encourage you to make sure you do a little research into the right tree, right place as you go try to select or potentially add trees to your landscape. I did mention earlier about how you can help as feeders. And there's a couple things that you need to be thinking about if you'd like to feed birds and kind of supplement that supply that's out there. You're going to want to place any of the feeders that you're using near shelter. So not out in the middle of an open field where the birds have to travel a long distance back and forth. You're kind of making them easy pickings for a lot of hawks or other predators that will learn that your feeder is a great place for them to also feed, even though they're not eating seeds, they're eating the birds. So having them near bushes, trees that they can bounce in and out of and kind of seek protection where they're not vulnerable very long. Try to avoid having them in areas of direct sunlight or right next to windows. And this is one that's tough because we often are putting feeders up so that we can enjoy seeing the birds. Well, those windows are killers. Birds fly into them all the time. It's one of the major drivers of bird mortalities over time. So we want to try to make sure we position them in places that they're not going to have the ability to fly into windows very easily. Do want to clean them out on a regular basis. Usually once a week with some bleach and water is plenty. And that's especially true for hummingbird feeders with that sugar content that can cause a problem. So what you can feed depends on the species that you're going to try to attract, right? So they all eat different things. So providing what they consume to the birds you want to attract is essential. The big thing is, blanket level black oil sunflowers is a wonderful resource for birds. It also has a tendency not to attract as many pest birds like your starlings and your house sparrows as much, especially the starlings, just because they have a smaller beak and can't crack them. If you do use things like safflower, it can be used, especially, it kind of discourages pest birds as well. But it is smaller and you will attract less variety of birds than, say, black oil sunflowers. Suet is one that you're going to want to use for a lot of your woodpeckers. And then there's other versions of specialty feeders like for orioles where you have jam and fruit feeders that's going to attract them more than, say, a black oiled sun. They're just not going to eat sunflowers. So the other thing is often, many people are into feeding birds and trying to manage their, yards for birds. What other things can you do to help if you're a bird enthusiast? start participating in many of the citizen science programs that are out there. Things like eBird, Merlin is a wonderful resource that both help you identify birds, but also help report them to many of the scientists that are trying to manage and make sure that we have birds in the future. iNaturalist is a wonderful one as well in terms of all things in ecology and outside. The bird specific ones that are really tied in directly to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which is where much of our management decisions are kind of figured out, are eBird and Merlin. That kind of plays into it. So those are resources that you should really become familiar with if you want to try to help birds and conserve birds for the future. Lastly here, I want to make sure to get this out there, especially if you are thinking about feeding birds. If you have an outdoor cat or your neighbors have an outdoor cat that is frequenting your yard, you don't want to feed birds. You don't, they're going to, as much as people think that they don't attack birds regularly, they do. There's a lot of work put into that with putting video cameras on collars of cats and asking their owners how many times they think the cat killed something and brought it back to them. And it's almost a 3 or 4-fold difference between what cats are killing versus what the owners are aware of. So if you have cats in the area, you do not want to be attracting birds to that locale anymore and putting them at any more risk than they're already at. You can do all the landscaping and everything else. That's great because that's providing both food and cover and making it very difficult for cats to hunt them and target them, like I mentioned with feeders and other predators. So just if you have cats in the area, or maybe it's your cat, and I'm just trying to provide a reason to try to convert them to an indoor cat, which is not always possible. I get that. I have 3 cats. All mine are indoor, and one of them is being worked into inside cat, and we're about 90% of the way there. So it's hard to get some cats to always want to be inside. Just if you have an outdoor cat, try not to bring birds to it. It's kind of the bigger message here. I'm going to wrap up with a bunch of resources that are out in there for you to key into. Things like we have a publication, FOR 97 for hummingbirds and how to attract hummingbirds to your yard. We also have our weekly webinar, which happens at Wednesdays at 11 for From the Woods Today. And the website for that, so if you Google From the Woods Today, UKY, get to the website, all of our old episodes there, and there's a mountain load of information there about managing for wildlife, managing your yards, picking trees, caring for trees, and so on and so forth. So please use that, as well as if you're looking to add trees to your property, the Division of Forestry has a nursery and sells those trees at a very reasonable rate and packages of 25 or more. So don't overlook that. Almost all of those, I want to say 98% of those trees they sell are native trees. So you immediately have that benefit and knowledge that this tree does belong in Kentucky.